My son shoved his chair back so hard the legs scraped the tile and the sound cracked the air like a warning. He was 8, maybe 9, fingers sticky from the pasta sauce he had insisted on helping me make, and he looked up at them with that tiny, hopeful face little kids wore when they still believed family was a safe place. For a second, I almost believed it too. Then my mother smiled and it ripped. "Look at him," she said, slow and loud like she was reading from the best part of a show. "Street dog. He eats like a stray. He doesn't belong at our table." My father clicked his fork against his plate like a judge hitting a gavel. "He should learn his place," he said. "You brought him here. You fed him. That's charity, not love." Please subscribe to our channel and tell us in comments from where are you watching this video. My son's fingers clenched the edge of the table so tight the knuckles went pale. He didn't move. He had learned the stillness that tried to protect him from their storms. He watched Mom reach across and flick a bit of sauce from his cheek with the back of her hand, and then, without a second thought, shoved her plate toward the trash can as if the motion itself were punishment. The plate hit the trash with a clatter. Food tumbled out, soft shapes of what minutes before had been warm and hopeful. My boy stared at the falling food the way people stare at small disasters on the news, stunned and numbly accepting. I felt something inside me break and then sharpen. I remember the sound of the plate like a gunshot in a hallway full of doors I had never opened. "Pick that up," Mom said, casual as watering a plant. "You'll learn to be grateful for scraps." My son bent down slowly, picking each piece of pasta off the floor with the tiny care of someone who believed even crumbs were treasure. I watched his hands, the motion seared into my memory, and I could feel the heat rise behind my eyes, not the hot anger that makes people shout, but the cold kind that measures and remembers. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his small one. He looked up at me with that hollowed-out hope. I swallowed and I said, "It's okay. Come sit with me." They laughed at that too. Not a soft laugh, a sharp one like clinking glass. My father said, louder now because cruelty liked an audience, "She spoils him. That's why he eats like a dog. You should learn dignity, boy. Dignity is not for you." My sister, who had always been the golden child, hair perfect, smile curated, small scandals smoothed, took a picture with her phone, smirking. "For the group," she said, and the way she said it made my blood run slow. I watched the screen light up and knew they would replay this like a private entertainment. I picked the crumbs up too, not because I agreed with their words, but because I couldn't stand my son thinking garbage was what we had. I pressed the damp pasta into my palm as if I could rewrite it into something kinder. I felt ridiculous and furious and so tired. They kept going. It was never one line. It was a rhythm, a build. First the jokes, the harmless teasing they'd practiced for decades like a family sport. Then the comparisons, to cousins, to neighbors' kids, to imaginary standards. Then the small humiliations that added up. Being told to clear his plate with children's hands while they ate the good parts. Being refused a second helping because someone else needed it more. Being told not to dream because dreaming made his sister uncomfortable. At one point, when my boy's mouth opened to protest, my mother slapped her hand down on the table and said, sharp as a knife, "Quiet. This is how the world treats trash. Don't let him think he deserves better." I remember sitting there and listening to the sound of their voices shape my son's small body into lessons. I remember thinking, with cold clarity, that this house had been a factory for erasing people and replacing them with obedient shadows. After they finished, my mother dabbed at her lips with a napkin like she had merely performed a civic duty. My father pushed his chair back and yawned, satisfied. My sister scrolled through the photos she took, already composing the captions in her head. The living room hummed with their contentment, the ugly kind that eats everything soft. I stood up and my knees felt unsteady. I had to steady myself on the back of my chair because the room tilted. My son looked at me with those eyes that had always trusted me to make the world safe. I felt a gravity pull at my ribs, a decision forming like an animal circling its future. I didn't pick up the trash. I didn't fight them verbally. I had tried shouting before, When I was younger, before the bruises and the quiet compliance, I had raised my voice and gotten a fist for my trouble. That night, I moved differently. I moved like someone cataloging proof. I lifted my son into my arms. He smelled of sauce and the tiny familiarness only a child has. He buried his face against my neck like he always did when he needed the world to smell less like knives. I could feel his small body trembling, and I wanted to fix it in an instant. Instead, I did something that felt like a promise. I memorized everything. I memorized the tone my mother used when she called him a dog. I memorized the exact angle of Dad's hand when he shoved the plate. I memorized the way my sister laughed and the way the screen lit her face like a reward. I memorized, with a terrifying tenderness, the shape of my son's small hands collecting crumbs. We left the table quietly. My son's shoes dragged a bit. He held on to me like he might float away if he loosened his grip. Outside, the night air was cold and smelled of wet earth. He buried his face further into my coat, and I felt the slow, steady beat of his heart against my chest. Small and stubborn and very alive. I sat on the stairs of our building after I tucked him into bed. I sat there in the dark with my palms pressed to my knees until my breath stopped shaking. The city breathed around me, sirens, distant laughter, a radio playing someone else's life, and I felt very, very small. I could have gone back inside and pretended it never happened. I could have smoothed the day into a polite lie. I could have whispered apologies to my son that mean nothing. Instead, I let the quiet stretch until it hardened into a plan seed. They taught him to be ashamed, to hide, to believe he was less. They taught me to accept the bruise as the price of belonging. I sat there and turned that shame over in my mouth until it tasted like a weapon. I would not let them teach him to accept scraps. I would not let them sleep peaceful. I promised myself, in the absolute privacy of that midnight, that I would remember every word, every motion, every laugh. I would fold them into the ledger of my life, and I would use them. I picked crumbs up in my mind, piece by piece, cataloging the offense like evidence. I traced each slight to its root until the pattern was clear. They had a hierarchy, and my son was at the bottom. They had become a little kingdom that fed on other people's pain. When I went to bed that night, I lay awake with my hands clasped like a prisoner who had found the key. The house hummed on the other side of thin walls, my parents asleep, their breaths even, untroubled. For the first time in a long while, I felt the steady chill of resolve tighten in my chest. I let it sink in. I did not want them to feel shame or guilt. I wanted them to feel the absence of the thing they took for granted. I wanted them to know what it was to miss the small, human warmth they had treated like trash. I would make sure they never ate in peace again, not by shouting or stealing, but by turning the rules they loved back on them. I would make them fix what they broke. I would make their days require the very thing they so casually discarded: responsibility, effort, the mundane labor of care. I would build walls around my son's life until their voices only grazed the surface and could not wound. That night, the crumbs were still on the floor in my head, each one a promise. I traced their edges with my memory until I knew their shape by heart. I slept with a plan forming behind my eyes. Slow, patient, inevitable. I started making small changes that felt like folding a map. Quiet, precise, edge by edge. I kept my son home from their dinners for a week after that night. I told him stories in the kitchen and let him help with real plates, the kind we used only on Sundays, and watched how his shoulders relaxed when no one shouted that he was less than. He learned to eat with his head up again, and each time he laughed without checking my face first. It felt like money in a bank I was building. I stopped answering their calls right away. At first, they tried guilt, texts about family, photos from dinners, captions like "missing our girl," the usual performance. When that didn't work, Dad began calling in anger. "You're ungrateful," he said when I finally let it go to voicemail. "You make us look bad." "You made my son look like trash," I said into his recording, calm in a way that made the anger in his voice sound like cheap theater. I listed dates, times, phrases, not for them, But for me, I recorded evidence with a memory that never lost details. It steadied me. I started making legal and practical moves no one in my family expected. I applied for a child benefit I'd never had the headspace to file for before. I moved my small savings into an account in my name alone. I enrolled my son in after-school activities far away enough that they couldn't casually intrude. I called a lawyer to ask a question, just one, about guardianship and visitation rights if someone shows repeated emotional neglect. The lawyer's voice was neutral and professional, and it taught me that rules exist to protect children from patterns, not to punish families for feelings. When they realized I'd stopped coming, they tried to shame me in front of relatives, but the relatives mostly shrugged. Everyone knew my parents' flavor of hostility. The truth is, most people count on parents to be flawed. They don't expect to be given paperwork. My sister sent a message. "You're making a scene. Mom's upset. You owe her respect." I read it and then put my phone face down. Respect cannot be demanded like rent. There was a day, a little ordinary Tuesday, when my son came home with a notice from school. A small, official-looking form about meals and support. The school counselor had included options for free school lunches if a family qualified. My throat tightened when I saw it. I'd been so focused on anger that I forgot that humiliation hits different places. The small, practical ones. I filled the form out and mailed it in. We started getting nutritious lunches that didn't smell like defeat. My son came home with his backpack lighter and his smile less guarded. That tiny change felt like a quiet victory. A turning point came when Dad called one afternoon and asked if I could lend them money. He couched it in old lines. Family duty, we're in a pinch. But the pitch stank of expectation. I could have given cash and watched them spend it on new shoes and salon appointments while my son learned to pick crumbs from trash. Instead, I told him plainly, "I can help if there are receipts and a plan. I will not be the ATM for cruelty." Silence swallowed the phone. Then their anger returned in full measure. "You're cold," Mom hissed into the receiver, the old script about ungratefulness. "You're worse than a stranger." That line landed the way they wanted it to, a barb. But inside, something had already changed. The thing I'd once been taught to fear, most, being labeled ungrateful, had become the lever I would use to pull them into structure. I didn't want them to suffer for suffering's sake. I wanted them to do the work of being decent. If they wanted my help, they would have to show it. I set boundaries and I stuck to them. I demanded receipts. I required meetings. I insisted on timelines. At first it felt petty, bureaucratic, almost cruel in its dryness. But bureaucracy is a mirror. They'd used my silence as an invoice for endless entitlement. I would invoice back. They struggled with it the way people who have always stolen your time struggle when the table flips. Awkwardly, with rage, then improvisation. They tried to bypass me through cousins and friends, but every intermediary needed me to okay anything that mattered. I met their schemes with calmly repeated conditions. Documentation first, accountability always. They called me stubborn and unnatural. I kept a ledger in my phone. The breaking point came when Dad fell ill, a collapse at the grocery store that left him dizzy and embarrassed. He was safe, nothing catastrophic, but it scared Mom into a frenzy. Suddenly their ego became thin and the patterns sped up. They called me, not because they wanted to apologize, but because the immediate practicalities, transportation, forms, follow-up, needed doing. Old habits told them to expect me to drop everything. I didn't drop everything. I offered help on my terms. I would drive him to the clinic if he signed a statement acknowledging the way they'd treated my son and agreed to family counseling, scheduled by a certified counselor I approved. I would help with medical forms if they provided proof of payment for previous year's expenses, where they'd insisted I cover things. I would help arrange temporary support if they signed a small legal agreement promising no unsupervised visits until behavior improved. It surprised them. It should not have. They had trained me for years. But they were so used to taking without rules that the sight of paperwork made them furious and frightened in equal measure. In the waiting room of the clinic, Mom paced like a caged animal, phone in orbit. Dad sat silent, the color drained from his face. My son sat beside me, fingers laced through mine, watching me like I was a lighthouse he'd found in fog. I felt like one too. Steady, blunt, and finally useful. They grumbled and bickered and finally, to my quiet astonishment, signed. Not because their hearts had changed in a single moment, but because the urgency of real need had stripped away their entitlement and left them bargaining with terms. They craved ease, and I offered only one: work for it. That evening, after the clinic, my son fell asleep with his head on my lap. I looked at his breathing and felt something settle inside me like armor. I knew the path forward would be long. It would not be pretty. It would require paperwork, boundaries, and the patience to make them do the mundane labor of care they had never bothered with. But I also knew it would finally tie their comfort to their actions. I had no illusions about revenge being a grand spectacle. This would be quieter, practical, repetitive, unavoidable. It would be a relentless trimming of their privileges until they had to face the small daily facts they had ignored. I would make them fix their own messes, step by ordinary step. When my son turned in his homework that night, he did it with his pencil sharp and his chin up. I closed the door to his room and put my palm against it, feeling the wooden grain. I whispered to no one, to the plan, to the memory of the night of the plate. I would make sure they never ate in peace again, not through cruelty, but through consequence. They came back to my life like broken things people return to a shop, hopeful they'd be fixed for free. The first week, I offered nothing but a schedule and a list. "You want help?" I asked. "Fine. Come twice a week, bring receipts, show up to counseling, volunteer at the food bank for 4 weeks. No unsupervised visits with him until we prove you can be decent." Dad's face went bright red with fury. Mom's mouth tasted of old excuses. Ava tried to bargain with charm and selfies. They all assumed I would cave, that the old grooves of taking and giving without work were still carved into me. They learned otherwise. I set up the appointments in the calendar. I sat across from the counselor during the first session and watched them flounder when kindness required paperwork. The counselor asked them direct, boring questions about routine care, about who paid for what, about how often the child ate dinner without someone mocking him. The questions made them uncomfortable, because the truth doesn't fit neatly into a childhood story. They showed up to the food bank with scraped knuckles from real work, hauling boxes, sweeping floors, signing their names in a log where other volunteers could see them. They marched into a world where charity wasn't a performance, but a ledger. I watched Dad carry boxes and his shoulders trembling in a way he never had when he carried bills to the salon. He complained, muttered about humiliation, but he did it. Mom learned how to fill out a form that asked for dates and amounts and signatures. Ava tried once and left early, deciding the work wasn't stylish enough. My son watched all of it with the same wide eyes he'd had at dinner the night of the plate, but this time he smiled with something steady, not brittle. He saw them do small things that mattered, and he saw them get nowhere special for it. Only the slow, grinding fact of actual labor and the thin relief of earned food. For months, I tied help to effort. If they needed a lift to a clinic because a twisted ankle made Dad limp, I asked for proof they'd attended counseling that week. If Mom wanted help with documents, I required she show receipts for previous expenses and a plan for not repeating the same pattern. When Ava begged for money for a last-minute shoot, I told her to apply for it through the agency and show me the contract. That was the part they hated, dealing with the mundanity of responsibility. They'd spent years treating my name and labor like a shortcut. I changed the rules. My assistance became petition-based, conditional, processed like an application. It sucked the entitlement out of them. One night, months later, they sat at the same dining table where they'd thrown my son's plate. The food was nicer than what usually showed up there. Someone had splurged, but it wasn't the warmth of home. They ate in a quiet that had nothing to do with satisfaction and everything to do with obligation fulfilled. My sister kept glancing toward the window where our son sometimes played in the communal courtyard with his friends. She no longer smiled at him the same way. She looked like a person trying to remember how to be soft. They sent passive-aggressive messages about fairness. They whispered that I was cruel. I didn't argue. Cruelty is an accusation that was never leveled when they turned my life into their buffet. Now it sounded small and thin, The final slack in the rope came when Dad asked for an unplanned loan for a car repair. He expected me to hand over cash and watch them spend it on a weekend out. I said no. Instead, I offered to connect him with a mechanic and a payment plan on the condition he show proof he'd paid 3 months of past utility bills they'd ignored. He asked how I could be so heartless. I drove him to the mechanic and sat in the waiting area while he signed the estimate. He fumbled with his wallet and handed the clerk a card with money scraped together from friends and some meager savings. He called me later that night and said quietly, "I didn't know it would feel like this." "What feel like what?" I asked. "Hunger," he said, "the kind that isn't fixed with a check." I thought about that answer for a long time. It wasn't malice. It was a dawning recognition. They were feeling the small, inconvenient emptiness they'd once handed to others as a lesson. They were learning, gradually and awkwardly, that the world doesn't forgive unpaid tab after years of taking. We didn't have a cinematic showdown. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no viral public humiliation. My revenge was not a spectacle. It was a slow, administrative restructuring of their comfort until their lives required the very things they had never offered: time, proof, effort. One winter evening, I walked past their house with my son on his scooter. He zipped ahead, laughing, and then turned back to show me a scraped knee he'd earned on the playground. We stopped a few houses down and watched the warm lights in our old home glow through curtains. Inside, they were packing boxes for a weekend trip they now could only afford by tightening budgets and doubling shifts. They looked smaller from where we stood, not because I had taken anything visible, but because the air between us had changed. My son reached up and took my hand without checking first if he had my permission. He didn't need to memorize cruelty anymore. He had learned to expect his place at a table where his plate stayed and his dignity was not negotiable. I let them eat what they had earned. Please subscribe to our channel and tell us in comments from where are you watching this video.